This is Duke University.
This panel is going to look at the social, environmental, and political dimensions of NAFTA after 20 years. I'm your moderator. My name's Steve Kelly. I'm a visiting professor here at the Sanford School at Duke University and a former U.S. diplomat who served in Canada and in Mexico. We have a distinguished and experienced group of people here to look at the social, environmental, and political dimensions. I'll start with my Duke colleagues here. Fritz Mayer, who's professor of public policy, political science, and environment here at Duke's Sanford School of Public Policy. Fritz's research is in three broad areas: globalization, the role of stories in politics, and recently the politics of climate change. What makes him a catch for our panel today is that he worked for Senator Bill Bradley during the Nafta negotiations and had an inside view. In fact, I think you were technically his senior international trade and foreign policy advisor. And he subsequently wrote a book called Interpreting NAFTA, The Art and Science of Political Analysis. So he has a good inside view of what was going on when NAFTA was created, and through his academic studies and teaching since then, has an appreciation for where it's gone. Sitting next to him is Bob Healy, who's Professor Emeritus of Environmental Policy at Duke's Nicholas School of the Environment. He was the director of the Center for International Studies here at Duke and also the director of the then-named Center for North American Studies. Bob's recently written a book with a Canadian and a Mexican co-author called Environmental Policy in North America: Approaches, Capacity, and the Management of Transboundary Issues. This is a unique volume. I teach a class here on North American issues, and I've never found a single volume that actually looks at environmental issues in a North American context. Bob's also looking for a Mexican publisher, so if you know anybody, please contact Bob when we're done here. Sitting next to Bob is Michael Hart, who is the Simon Reisman Chair in Trade Policy at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University in Ottawa. He's extremely experienced in trade issues and the U.S.-Canadian foreign relationship. He did a Fulbright at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington. He's also a former official in Canada's Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade. Also an author, a book called A Trading Nation. His specialization is in trade policy and in trade negotiations. And our last panelist, we had to twist his arm to get him here. Antonio Ortiz Mena, he's head of section for economic affairs at the embassy, the Mexican embassy in Washington, where I think he's going to become a permanent fixture. He's been there since 2007. We're very glad he is there. He also had a foot in academia in a previous life. He was professor of international relations at CDE, and also he was a member of the original NAFTA negotiating team. So you have a group of people who have been watching NAFTA from the beginning and who are still involved in the evaluation of it and where it might go in the future. So I think we'll begin with Dr. Mayer, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve, and thanks to Jane and Patrick and Gary and the other organizers. It's really a pleasure for me to be here and to think about NAFTA. I confess that it's not been my focus over the last few years that closely, but I was, as was said, sort of had an inside, not just an inside view, but as it happened, I ended up playing, behind the scenes role much greater than I expected. I had a fellowship from the Council on Foreign Relations, and I wanted to work on NAFTA. And initially, I was going to go work at the USTR, but the timing was such that the agreement was reached commercial agreement was reached in August of '92. And so the game was going to shift to the Congress. And Bill Bradley I'm a failed basketball player, And so Bill Bradley was always one of my heroes, and so I had the chance to go work for Bradley. And the interesting thing about Bradley was that this was his highest priority. Bradley, picked issues, and really, those of you who don't know, very thoughtful, very impressive member of the Senate, and he had, for him, NAFTA was his top priority, and so he brought me in to be a strategist for NAFTA. That was my job, was to behind the scenes to try to work that street. So I ended up at a staff level having a lot more authority than I expected or influence. Moynihan, who was the chair of the Finance Committee, was on the fence, eventually opposed, so the Chief Trade Counsel was frozen. I ended up running the effort to actually pass the agreement in the Senate. I worked very closely in the House. So what I thought I'd do, maybe just partly because I get to go first, is put a little bit of historical perspective on it in terms of what we thought we were doing at the time. And then I'll comment specifically a bit on the labor side. 22 years ago this month, Bill Clinton gave a speech in Raleigh. He was then a candidate for president. You may recall a gentleman by the name of Ross Perot was also running for president at that time, and he was going around the country talking about a giant sucking sound and the big years of jobs going to Mexico. Bill Clinton, candidate Clinton, was under enormous pressure from labor groups in particular, some environmental groups, a lot of liberal Democrats, to back away from NAFTA, which he sort of cautiously supported. I wrote a memo under Bradley's signature that went to Little Rock that said that this would be a very bad thing to back away from. Your biggest weakness as a candidate is you're thought of as kind of a waffler. You can't stay. So you have to stick with this. But what you want to do to mollify the labor and environment groups is say that you're going to support this, but we're going to have side negotiations on labor and environment. And there were others advising this, but there it is. This is almost word for word in the speech in Raleigh. Anyway, so I ended up being quite involved in that whole process as well. And I could talk a bit about the labor side agreement or those side agreements if people want to. I thought though maybe I'd focus more on the more general impacts of labor. The impacts on labor, jobs, that was the currency of the day. That was sort of the big focus. And there was always an enormous challenge to unpack the real likely effects of NAFTA from the imagined effects. I remember hosting a group from the Glassblowers Union in New Jersey, and they came to meet with Bill Bradley, and they got shuffled off to meet with me, so they were kind of pissed off. And to begin with, and they said, they came in, they said, we used to have, I don't know, 10,000 members of our union, and jobs are just going everywhere. All this stuff is going to Mexico, and we're down to 200. I don't know what the future of this is, and I figured I got them, it's because we haven't actually done NAFTA yet, so it can't be NAFTA. And I tried to explain this to them, and they said, what are you talking about? NAFTA is killing us. Anyway, we still hadn't negotiated. Therein lies an ongoing problem for this agreement. People like Gary are putting out very sensible, sober analyses of the likely impact, net gain of jobs, et cetera. Try arguing that to an angry glassblower sitting in your office is extremely, extremely difficult. In the end, we ended up focusing a lot on competitiveness, was the argument of North American competitiveness. And you may remember at that moment, the danger wasn't China, it was Japan. And we searched for who could be the best spokesperson to articulate the case that NAFTA would make North America much more competitive vis-a-vis Japan. And we came up with, I was working with the Business Roundtable and the lobbying groups, et cetera, and so we came up with Lee Iacocca, who some of you will recall was the former head of Chrysler and was known for having competed toughly with, with Japanese imports. Anyway, that was the focus then on competitiveness. And leaving aside its political virtues, I think that was, in fact, a good focus. I mean, in the sense that in the end, this wasn't so much about creating American jobs, although in net we probably were going to. But the truth of the matter is that those were always going to be, a couple months worth of jobs relative to the vast expansion that was taking place. But really it was about making North America more competitive, enabling the kind of rationalization, the production across North America, et cetera. And so I think that was, in fact, a sort of fair argument. In any event, for public purposes, the argument took that form. This was a defensive measure against Japan. In the U.S., of course, the focus was always on the impacts on the U.S., but I think even then we were arguing, at least Bradley was arguing, that the real issue was what impact NAFTA was going to have on Mexico. And if you look at the genesis of this, the NAFTA agreement, I mean, really it was Mexico, the Mexican leadership, who asked for NAFTA, who wanted initially a bilateral with the U.S. Why? Well, it was part of a whole effort to restructure the Mexican economy, to, in some sense, to lock in the kind of reforms that Salinas and his predecessor had initiated. It was very much about attracting investment to Mexico. And so, notwithstanding how it was sold to the American public as kind of a job creator and competitiveness, from the beginning, I think, and this is consistent with Roberta's comments, I mean, it was really from the U.S. perspective about a foreign policy move. Mickey Cantor came up to testify, for his, his hearings to confirm him. He was the USTR that came in with Clinton, and everybody's, all the other senators are, I'm upset about sugar beets, and I'm upset about, my broom makers or whatever it was, furniture. So all these sort of. So Bradley sort of says, good to have you here. NAFTA is the most important foreign policy decision of Clinton's first term. That was his first sentence. And for Bradley, and I might have had some hand in that sentence, but always it was understood as, for us anyway, was understood as potentially transformative of the nature of the relationship with Mexico, and a first step, really, in a kind of deeper integration of the kind that we're sort of now optimistically talking about. We were always asking Mexico. Mexico was always being asked to do the most. The biggest changes were in Mexico. I mean, obviously there are changes on the U.S. side, but we really had, relatively open borders compared to Mexico. So this was about pushing Mexico and locking in the kind of open policies, open economic policies that Salinas and his advisors supported. How has that worked? Well, I think it's worked about as well as we thought it was going to work. I mean, as I look at this, and there are other more expert people here than me and who've been following this more closely, but I think a realistic assessment of what realistic expectations of what we could expect at that time would have led us to think that this was, net positive for the U.S. In terms of job creation. There'd be jobs lost and jobs won, but in net, very positive, but not huge. Important for the competitiveness of North America, rationalization of industry across the borders, and hugely significant for Mexico. Now, I have to say just a couple other things, and I don't want to go beyond my time limits here. I do think the Mexican leadership and us and a lot of us who were pushing for the free trade, for free trade, probably underestimated the costs of transition. I remember a meeting with Bradley, myself, and Pedro Aspe, who was the finance minister of Mexico, and the conversation turned to sort of noting that in Mexico, about 30% of the population at that point was in agriculture, working in agriculture. And Aspe asked, when was what was the last time the United States had 30% of its workforce in agriculture? And Bradley said, well, almost exactly 100 years ago. 1892. And asked me, so that's really interesting. He said, and then Bradley said, well, in the next 20 years, we went from 30 to 10%. And asked me, said, oh, was that hard? And Bradley said, well, I have a few books you might want to read. But I think there was probably, not to diminish the efforts made in Mexico, because there were efforts, but I think probably all of us underestimated what the nature of the ask. I won't say anything much now about the labor side agreement if people are interested in that. Just to note, I mean, this was a political fix in a political context, the idea of creating these side agreements. Initially, the environmental groups in the U.S. really wrote the first draft, working with the USTR, and it was the same draft for the labor agreement. I won't go into the details of it, but it's a fascinating case study in bargaining dynamics, if any of you are interested, because the essence of what happened was that from an initial first draft in which the U.S. was the demander in these negotiations, where you had sort of parallel labor and environment agreements, what you found was that, first of all, the Mexican government and the Canadians, to some extent, hated the whole idea of doing these things, but they really hated the labor provisions. The business community wasn't thrilled with either, but they really didn't like the labor provisions. And the one group that really wanted to push for labor, the American labor unions, weren't going to support NAFTA no matter what we did. This is a bad negotiating position. So I remember the last day of the side negotiations, Bradley was on the phone with Clinton, who was flying in Air Force One, and the issue was, can we do one last tweak to get Dick Gebhardt vote? And we were scrambling, and there was conversation between Pepe Cordoba, and there were very high-level conversations, and the answer was there was nothing on God's earth that was going to get that vote, and we got to pull the plug on this. And so I would say that agreement, the labor side agreement, ended up being pretty thin. Last point. Goes to the conversation earlier. We created, when I came back, I was founding director, first director of the Center for North American Studies, and it was a moment of a great optimism about NAFTA being the first step of a much deeper integration project. And Bob Pastor and I talked a great deal about this, and he started a similar thing. Maybe we were just ahead of our time. Many things are happening, more than probably meets the eye to the public. But it does seem to me, now coming back to it and thinking about it again, that the rationale for deeper integration that was present 20 years ago is, if anything, even greater today. And it's exciting to think about, or at least to hear an optimistic take on the possibilities there. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Bob, over to you, the environment, 20 years later.
Well, NAFTA and the environment in 10 minutes. That's a little bit like one of these performances of all of Shakespeare in an hour. I will hit the high points. In the year or so before NAFTA was approved by Congress in November 1993, as Fritz pointed out, a great deal of concern was expressed about what expanded trade would mean for the environment. I mean, after all, this was an agreement that would allow a redistribution of economic activity between two countries, Canada and the US, that had relatively well-developed environmental regulatory regimes, and one, Mexico, that at least at the time did not. And environmental organizations and other free trade opponents argued for what came to be known as the pollution haven hypothesis. And in its strongest form, it argued that the very dirtiest industries facing regulation in Canada and the US would simply move their plants to the browner pastures of Mexico. In response to this concern, an environmental side agreement was added to the NAFTA treaty at the last minute, and this satisfied some environmental groups, but others, such as the Sierra Club, pointed out that the environmental agreement had no direct enforcement mechanism, and they continued to oppose NAFTA. So now, 20 years after NAFTA went into effect, what can we say about its impact on the environment? A number of studies, some of them pretty sophisticated, have shown little support for this strong version of the pollution haven hypothesis. For most industries, environmental compliance costs really aren't large enough to shift location. And for those where they might be, like non-ferrous metal smelting, the location of the resource really dictates where their plants are. And for some of the very worst that we're talking about at the time, like asbestos in benzidine dyes, the fact is these were negative growth industries because the products were problematic and nobody was building any plants. Now, there's some evidence that plants in a few sectors, especially those emitting sulfur dioxide or hazardous waste, may have been differentially drawn to Mexico. But the fact is that low labor costs and transportation infrastructure are really responsible for the vast majority of location decisions. Far more relevant for the environment, I think, has been the general growth of many of the export cities on the Mexican side of the U.S. border. Between 1990 and 2010, Ciudad Juarez grew from 800,000 to 1.3 million. Reynosa went from 300,000 to over 600,000. Tijuana from less than 1 million to more than 2 million. And urban infrastructure has not, of all types, has not kept up with this growth. Air and water pollution are serious problems in these cities, both on the Mexican side and in many cases it drifts over the U.S. border. Now, these local problems, though, have produced a number of local responses that people tend not to know about that involve trans-border collaboration between cities and states and NGOs, not just official federal international cooperation. And the same phenomenon has been observed in the U.S.-Canada border, especially in the greater Vancouver region and in some places on the Great Lakes. There's also been significant collaborations that were inspired by NAFTA, but are outside its framework, where federal agencies on both sides of the border are collaborating. For example, wildlife management agencies in the U.S. and Mexico have extensively collaborated in managing transboundary parks and in reintroducing animals with transboundary ranges, notably the jaguar and the Mexican wolf. And incidentally, these efforts would be gravely affected if we had a continuous border fence. Now, the environmental side agreement to NAFTA worked by creating an entity called the Commission on Environmental Cooperation. How well has this worked? Well, in my judgment, rather better than one would expect, given that the Commission had essentially no enforcement powers. The Commission has the authority to receive what are called citizen submissions, and these are complaints that a national government was not following its own national environmental laws. To date, 31 have been submitted concerning Canada, 41 for Mexico, 12 for the US. And many of these actually seem rather remote from NAFTA and free trade. For example, a complaint that the province of Quebec was not adequately enforcing its standards for automobile emissions, or a complaint that Mexico was allowing loggers to devastate the remote mountain lands of the Tarahumara Indians. Now, if the Commission finds that the citizen plea is plausible and important, it can call on the national government involved to produce a mandatory factual record that describes and defends what it did under its laws with the problem. And to date, 22 of these have been prepared, 11 for Mexico, 9 for Canada, there's a lot of complaints about Canada, and 2 for the US. These statements force national governments to release a great deal of information on their enforcement practices. And the embarrassment factor alone can cause reforms. And if not, the information that's provided can give environmental groups or sometimes local concerned citizens the information they need to gain public sympathy for their cause and sometimes a legal basis for a suit that would compel enforcement. Now, in addition to the citizen submission process, the Commission has released a number of quite good and unique studies of trinational environmental problems. In particular, it has published data sets that are available no place else. For example, a list of the largest air polluters, industrial air polluters in all 3 countries. Now, moving on from the CEC, in a very small number of cases, NAFTA itself has complicated in local environmental protection efforts. For example, for many years, ending in 2010, the City of Toronto shipped its solid waste to landfills in rural Michigan. When the rural municipalities received the waste, started to object, and the state of Michigan followed, they found that NAFTA actually said that refusing this waste was a violation of NAFTA. In another very high-profile case, a Mexican municipality closed a toxic waste dump operated by a U.S. company called Metalclad, and a Canadian judge, citing NAFTA, ordered the Mexican government to pay the company $15 million in compensation. Kind of shocking, but this case is actually somewhat less than it appears, I think, because the company was being compensated for confiscation of an operation for which it had obtained a Mexican permit. And the $15 million it got was only a fraction of the $130 million in damages that it sought. Now, I'll conclude by mentioning 2 other areas of environmental concern: agriculture and energy. And Steve says that these will be discussed more in the afternoon. I just want to make some connections to the environment very quickly. For agriculture, NAFTA called for a phased transition from a closed to an open market in Mexico for U.S. and Canadian grain, especially corn. And a unilateral decision by Mexico speeded this up. Now, the influx of cheap corn and other food and feed grades into Mexico may have hastened agricultural modernization, but they also made production agriculture impossible for millions of small farmers. And this has been arguably a social tragedy, but its impact on the environment, I think, is mixed. Just as in the U.S. in the 1940s and 1950s, abandonment of small farms has reduced erosion and localized contamination with chemicals, and has started a transition of marginal, often hilly land from farm to forest. That could happen in Mexico as it has in the U.S. and would be a good thing for the environment in the long run. On the other hand, industrialized agriculture, including confinement feeding of chickens and hogs, has been bad for the environment. So I think this is a long story and one that we won't know the overall effect of this for decades. One thing that's especially problematic, though, has been the import of genetically modified corn. And this is intended for human and animal feed, not for planting, which is not allowed in Mexico. Mexico is the genetic source, the so-called Vavilov Center for corn worldwide. And there's real concern that the planting of GMO corn will cause contamination of the local so-called landrace species. And there's some evidence that this has already taken place in Jalisco, where corn biodiversity is highest, where corn originated. And the last area of environmental concern, it's already been mentioned by Secretary Jacobson, is energy. North American production is ramping up, whether through hydraulic fracturing in the US, tar sands in Western Canada, or the new oil and gas fields that Mexico is certainly going to open up to support its national budget. The production, transport, refining, and consumption of energy all have obvious environmental consequences. And I think the only sure expectations is that certain of these impacts are going to be large, and potentially some impacts, for example, another offshore disaster like the BP blowout in the Gulf could be enormous. So thank you for your attention.
The environment in 10 minutes. That was great. Professor Hart.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Jane and Amy, Sarah, and Gary for organizing this conference and inviting me to come. It provided me with a nice break from teaching. Someone took my class on Monday, so I've had a nice break, and I'm going to see some family in the neighborhood. But I'm not here for that purpose. I'm here to kind of give a Canadian perspective on the NAFTA 20 years after, and I'm happy to do so. I'm a veteran of those negotiations, even more so of the negotiations which led up to that, which was the bilateral Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, which was arguably the most contentious and difficult and important trade negotiation that Canada ever conducted. It tore up the nation. It required an election, but in the end it was implemented, and it has had a very, very large impact on the Canadian economy as the Canadian economy adjusted to becoming a more open and a more competitive economy and accepted the fact that they could no longer be the kind of sheltered economy which exported resources and protected its manufacturing industry. So now we have a much smaller manufacturing sector, but a much more competitive one, and a much larger and competitive tertiary sector, which I think is a very healthy development for the Canadian economy. Obviously, that agreement did not have the same impact, either politically or economically, in the United States, but I think it was a critical precursor to the negotiation of the NAFTA, and really was part of a 10-year period of very innovative, expansionary negotiations around the world. In North America, we focused on the bilateral and the trilateral negotiations, but concurrent with that, the Europeans went through a similar kind of exercise as they deepened their integration movement and expanded it. There was a similar kind of activity between Australia and New Zealand. There was activity in East Asia, and ultimately there was activity multilaterally in the GATT. The members of the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, in the Uruguay round, expanded the coverage of the agreement and deepened the commitments that governments were able to make. So in that 10-year period, the world trading system expanded exponentially, becoming deeper and wider, and including many more countries and products in its coverage, including moving from just a goods regime to a regime that covered services, began to think about covering investment, and dealt with intellectual property, and initiated a dispute settlement mechanism, all of which had been pioneered initially in the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. So you can imagine how important all those negotiations were over this 10-year period. And it created a certain amount of exhaustion, but interestingly enough, also enthusiasm for more. And it was interesting that there was a kind of a wide acceptance within the trade community that these were precursors to something more, such as a Western Hemisphere agreement, a much deeper World Trade Agreement, and so on, none of which has happened. Because I think what those agreements initially did is they satisfied a commercial need. All of those agreements were very much driven by commercial perspectives. It was the business community that in each country initiated the need for these negotiations. In the case of Canada, for example, I was heavily involved in the preparatory work, and what was interesting is that the federal government, which in the end was responsible for the negotiations, was the last party on board. The business community had been on board for 2 or 3 years. The provincial governments had been on board. Various business associations had been on board. And the federal government only reluctantly accepted that this is what it had to do. And it was made easier by the fact that we had a change in government from a liberal to a conservative government. But once it was done, the country stood behind it, except for those people you can always count on who oppose any kind of integration, any effort to open markets, any effort to respond to business interests and so on. And they can be extremely effective with the media because the media loves this kind of controversy, this kind of alarm, and so will report it in very large terms. And so the first thing that naive negotiators like me had to learn is that when you embark on this kind of project, you learn politics. You learn to communicate effectively. And that was one of the hardest things that we had to do. But it's interesting, a couple of years after we had concluded it, I was at a conference in Colorado, and Bruce Babbitt, who later became Clinton's Interior Secretary, was the speaker at the luncheon. And various business speakers asked, why are we talking about the environment and labor when we're really trying to see if we can get negotiations started on a trade agreement? And Babbitt kind of fumbled it because he hadn't had that kind of experience yet. But I said, well, we learned in Canada that one of the things that happens when you have a major public policy issue that really is the subject of daily newspaper coverage, every group in the country will latch onto that in order to get its own message across. I got into a little trouble with the government because I mentioned that we'd heard about the bishops against free trade, but not the ones for free trade. And there was a march of lesbians against free trade, but not for free trade. The government thought I might have gone a little too far. But I've now retired from government. I've been gone out of government for 19 years. So I take no responsibility for any kind of political ill will that I may cause today. But I explained to the audience later, after lunch, that yes, we had had that similar kind of experience, and you need to accommodate that. You need to address that, or else the politicians in the end will start to get cold feet. And so the reason we have the agreements that both Fritz and Bob mentioned is because there was a groundswell of interest in doing this. And because as trade negotiators, we had no experience in that, but we consulted with the right people and so on, and our government reluctantly agreed that this was something that had to be done, and the instruction to the lawyer who wrote it up was, write it up in such a way that it looks good, but is impossible to implement. And he was very good at that. He was one of those lawyers who believed that using 10 words where one will do is much better. And so these are very long agreements with very little content. In the case of the labor agreement kind of operated for a few years. The Secretariat was initially placed in Dallas at the request of the mayor of Dallas, but then moved to Washington, and I think it now operates out of a toilet in the State Department. It really doesn't function anymore. The CEC, the Environmental Agreement, turned out to be a pleasant surprise, much more so than people had initially thought, for the reason that Bob explained. It provided a very important political outlet for people to complain, and it provided a transparency provision. So there's never been a question of enforcement, but it has provided that those two important functions, and the Secretariat in Montreal has found enough business to keep itself in operation and requiring the three governments to spend some time looking into its work. So it's quite useful. So looking back at NAFTA 20 years ago, or looking back to that whole movement from the perspective of 20 years, what I can say is that as trade policy, these agreements were a very important success. They were a very important part of creating the kind of movement, the kind of change that was required to accommodate the deepening of business around the world, or what we called 20 years ago globalization. It provided a much better set of rules. Business has adjusted to that, to the point now where business is organized very differently than it was in the prime GATT era of the 50s through the 70s. Business now operates in a much more disaggregated way, and Gary is one of the leading experts on the way business is now organized, and business looks at the rules very differently. And so these rules that were negotiated in that 20-year period have provided part of the assistance that business needed in order to reorganize itself on a global basis, together with big improvements in technology, in communications and transportation. But this was the policy element that allowed this to happen. And so from a policy perspective, we now look forward, what is next? Now, there's no shortage of activity. In the 20 years since then, all three governments have decided that negotiating bilateral agreements is great fun. And so many bilateral agreements. I think you're the champion in Mexico in negotiating these bilateral agreements. The United States has negotiated a lot. The government of Canada has negotiated quite a number. As a matter of fact, in Canada, we're much better at starting than at finishing these negotiations, because starting is quite easy. It provides a wonderful opportunity for a minister to get up on his hind feet and announce an initiative and so on. But in the end, in negotiating a bilateral agreement, you also have to make concessions, and that sometimes is difficult. I'll give you just one example. I was sent to Israel to give a speech in, I think it was 1992 or 1993, a year after I had sat down with the Israeli ambassador and tell him that there was no chance that Canada would ever negotiate a free trade agreement. Well, they went political. The government told me to do it, and I went and gave a speech about what a wonderful agreement this would be. That led to an even more wonderful agreement, an agreement with Jordan. Now, the only thing that we were trading with Jordan at this time was sand, as far as I was aware. But the government had decided, because we had an agreement with Israel, we had to show that we were not tilting one way or the other, so we were going to negotiate an agreement with Israel. When we asked the Jordanians if they were interested, they said, no, never heard of it. The idea is crazy. Following year, King Hussein was in Ottawa meeting with our Prime Minister, Mr. Chrétien, and they each had a briefing book, which they probably hadn't read in depth. But by chance, Mr. Chrétien had read the brief that said that Jordan was not interested in the free trade agreement. And so, seeing he had very little to talk about with the king, he blurted out, why not? The king, not having such a brief, said he didn't know. And so between the two of them, they had to announce something when they came out of the Prime Minister's office. They announced that Canada and Jordan would negotiate a free trade agreement. Okay, that's how much thought goes sometimes into these kinds of negotiations. I can tell you it was not a controversial negotiation, but it only took 12 years to complete. So last year, I was asked by the Senate to come and testify in favor of this agreement, and I said, for God's sake, why did we need somebody to testify in favor? So I came and testified and said, if anything, you need to get this legislation through to show the rest of the world that we can finish a negotiation. That we've got a number of other ones like that. We also have plurilateral negotiations going on, the TPP, the TTIP, the Uruguay round, which is now beginning to smell because it died at least 5 years ago, but nobody will accept that and bury it. But, these are all going on. So the world is awash in trade negotiations, but very little of consequence is being finished. And there's a very good reason for that. From the business community, the work is largely done. What these negotiations deal with is things at the edges. That would be nice, but it'd be very, very hard to bring a group of CEOs, not their government relations managers, but CEOs to a room to pound the table with the president or the prime minister or the president of Mexico and say, this negotiation is important to us, because that isn't true. So what we're now pursuing is not a business agenda, but a bureaucratic agenda. And bureaucratic agendas will never have the same kind of salience, the same kind of importance with the politicians that one that is driven by an outside and important interest group. And so these negotiations will continue, but they will not have the kind of impact that that earlier set of negotiations will have, because they're just not responding to a deep-seated business concern. So you can, in part, thank the NAFTA and its fellow agreements of 20 years ago for making things so open that to a business audience, these are not the most important issues. If you sit down with a group of CEOs today and ask them what are the most important public policy issues that they want government to address, the first one they will mention is taxation, that the tax load is far too heavy and far too complicated. Secondly, they will mention regulatory issues, that the regulatory load is too large, too heavy, and needs to be reformed. Trade is way down It is just not important. And so from my perspective, and Gary has heard me on this a number of times, the really big issue for trade negotiators today is to deal with two issues. One is regulatory convergence, and two, border management. Those are the issues that if you do sit down with a group of CEOs and ask them about what are the important trade-related issues, they will tell you the regulatory problem and the border problem, because both of them cost them money in time, in complication, in filling in forms and everything else. So that's what they want done. Now, Canada and the U.S., and to some extent the U.S. and Mexico, have been experimenting with that challenge. Unfortunately, it's going very slowly. It's one of those things where it's easy to start, difficult to get on with it. And in part, because this requires really inspired political leadership. You cannot get the officials throughout government who deal with that, because these are not trade officials. This is not USTR and the Trade Department. This is spread far through the government to deal with these two issues. It is very hard to convince the Department of Homeland Security that they need to streamline border management. Because 20 years ago, the people at the border were revenue officers. They reported to the Treasury and to the finance departments. Today, they are policemen. They're all armed. They see their role as a security and police function rather than as a trade function. And so to try to explain to them and convince them that a more simplified procedure with a lot of things done in common just isn't part of their mindset. Because I've written a number of papers on this, and they say, well, very interesting, but I'm sorry, you're not speaking our language. And on the regulatory issues, similarly, you're dealing with people in various agencies, and when you tell them you want to deal with these and so on, they say, we have a law, we have a regulation, we have a mandate. And so what you're trying to do it does not fall within that mandate. And so it's an extremely difficult thing to do. And as Gary mentioned to me one time, I was laying out an agenda that would keep trade officials employed for at least 100 years. I hope not quite that long, and I hope there will be more progress. But currently, those two issues lack political leadership and political will. There really is no leadership in Washington, and I don't know in Mexico City, but in Ottawa, the Prime Minister's had it up to here with your president. I don't want to go into that, but they're no longer friends. There have been enough issues in the relationship, and I will leave it to my former colleague Gilles to explain how much the Canadian government loves the current U.S. administration. But that is a huge obstacle. So I appeared before our Senate a couple of weeks ago to talk about the Canada-U.S. relations, and I said, aim your report at 2 years from now, because the current administration is a wash. It's a waste. Nothing's going to happen. But with a new administration and a new Congress 2 years from now, we may be able to kind of rekindle interest in the negotiations we've had so far and make some progress. So let me end there. I think I've used a little bit more than my 10 minutes, and I may have, embarrassed Gilles enough. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Antonio.
Great. Thank you. I'd like to thank Duke for this invitation and for convening such a great group to discuss North American issues. And I've gone on the opposite direction that Michael Hart was, because I took a leave of absence from academia and now I'm in government, so I do have to mind my words just a bit more, because I would embarrass myself if I go out on a limb. I'll give a brief overview from a Mexican perspective about the Nafta negotiations, and I'll focus then after that on a more prospective view and touch upon some of the things that Fritz and Robert and Michael mentioned. As Fritz, I was also involved in the Nafta negotiations. They were really a sea change for us. People, take them for granted these days, and they say, NAFTA's not enough. It hasn't solved, the world's problem, environmental, labor, whatever. But it really was, a sea change. When we were studying elementary school, we were shown, a map of Mexico in the mid-19th century, and then the current map, and the U.S. had taken part of our territory. Our foreign policy was very defensive. So when we were told we were going to engage with the U.S. in a free trade agreement, there was like, a huge political, almost psychological change in Mexico. I mean, it's truly a revolution. And I would say that it was different than from the case in Canada. There was no business push for a free trade agreement between Mexico and the U.S. This was a political decision after we had experienced very low rates of economic growth in the 1980s. That's the quote-unquote lost decade, the decade of the foreign debt. And then the Berlin Wall had fallen in 1989, and our first inclination was to go to Europe to try to attract investment from Europe, but Europe was concentrating on Europe. So then the second best for us was to negotiate with the U.S., and we approached the U.S. and started a bilateral deal, which subsequently became a trilateral deal. And there was also a huge concern in Mexico about a giant sucking sound with Mexican accent, not with a Texan accent. And the reason was that Mexican businesses feared they would not be able to compete with very large U.S. companies which had much better access to technology and to capital. So they feared Mexican job losses with U.S. job gains. So you would have completely opposing predictions in terms of jobs. The bottom line is that this was a way to better integrate the production in the region and to rationalize production. But a lot of this discussion involved around jobs. And I think that was just the politics of it, but not the substance. And negotiations were very complicated, very controversial. There was no precedent for such a deep integration agreement between two developed countries and a developing country. I mean, at the time, the Canada-U.S. agreement was, very, very advanced. It had, new provisions on anti-dumping, dispute settlement, on investment, on services, agriculture, super controversial topic still today. So we were treading upon new ground. And I think that, with retrospect, it is safe to say that NAFTA has been successful in its own terms, because people sometimes see NAFTA as these Rorschach psychological tests. Whatever they want to see into NAFTA, they see there, like, those ink blots. But if you look at the NAFTA preamble and the NAFTA objectives to reduce barriers to trade and investment in the region and to make for a more predictable business environment, then NAFTA has been very successful, and trade has increased in a significant manner, and intra-regional investment has increased in a significant manner. I like to quote the figure about $1 million in bilateral Mexico-U.S. trade every minute. I'm sure we'll get lots of more statistics. And Mexico has become a very important destination for U.S. exports. I don't think that was foreseen to the extent that it is now. The U.S. is exporting more to Mexico than to the Brazil, Russia, India, and China combined, than to the BRICS combined. When I gave talks on NAFTA a few months earlier, I used to say that the U.S. was exporting more to Mexico than to all the countries that had won the Soccer World Cup combined. We were all talking soccer. So, it has been very, very significant from that perspective. But what we talk less about is the growing regional supply chains. And here, I remember, Path Breaking, or by Gary Giraffi, that I started reading in grad school at UC San Diego. And what's this about global commodity chains? I mean, what are you talking about, And now, in my day-to-day work, that's what I think about. I think about regional production and supply chains. I think about Mexican investment in the U.S. I think about Canadian investment in Mexico, and I think that really has changed the economic landscape. We are really producing goods regionally for the North American markets and for other markets. I mean, the auto sector, it's obvious, but it's increasingly so in the aerospace sector. Not a lot of people know that there are over 200 aerospace companies in Mexico. There's a huge Bombardier investment in Querétaro, and we are just starting to understand how this is playing out. Assistant Secretary Jacobson mentioned, the value added that comes from Canada in terms of U.S. imports. That's at 25% U.S. value added in U.S. imports coming from Canada, and a 40% U.S. value added in U.S. Imports coming from Mexico, which is about a 10-to-1 ratio in terms of the value added of Chinese imports coming into the U.S. So we really are producing goods together. And if we look towards the future, say 20, 30 years from now, I think we'll see some pretty striking things. I reviewed a couple of studies, like one by PricewaterhouseCoopers, that estimates that in 2050, the US and Canada will have the world's highest per capita GDP. Mexico will be the world's 7th largest economy, and will have the highest per capita GDP in Latin America. From a demographic perspective, in 2050, North America as a whole will have a very complementary demographic profile in terms of median age. If you look at other regions like Europe, they're aging and they have a big challenge. Even China, a lot of people have not focused on China, but if you look at China's profile, they have a big challenge, and you cannot change these things. I mean, they're structural. So here, North America has a big advantage in its demographics, and also in oil. Again, there are all sorts of estimates, and what I've learned about energy these past years, and that's you should not do any predictions, but I'll go ahead and just cite some studies from BP and Exxon, and according to them, by 2035, North America will be a net oil exporter, accounting for 6% of global energy exports. And when I drafted this a couple of weeks ago, I had by 2017 the region could become a net exporter of natural gas, and my research assistant told me, it's now by 2015. But anyway, it will be the only region that will switch from being a net energy importer to a net exporter. Okay, so we have the demographics, we have the energy, and baseline models predict very robust growth for North America. Now, to turn this potential into reality, I do believe that we need politics or political leaders working together with academia, working together with business. I would posit that through NAFTA we created rules but not roads, if I can use that expression. That is to say, reduce barriers to cross-border trade and investment flows, but there are a lot of transaction costs. And Michael Hart mentioned the ones that I also think are the most important: border issues and regulatory issues. We are addressing some of them through a bilateral mechanism called the High-Level Economic Dialogue, which was launched in May 2013 when President Obama visited Mexico. And through the HLED, different government agencies on both sides of the border are working together on some key initiatives, because as Michael said, different agencies have different priorities, and sometimes it's very difficult to align agencies within a country, never mind between countries. So the HLED is a very, very important process that's helping us think through issues such as, border efficiency, about regulatory cooperation, which we've been engaging with for several years, but it's been going very, very slowly. I absolutely agree. We started a high-level regulatory cooperation council in 2010, and it's been more than 4 years, and we don't really have a lot to show for that. And business is keenly interested in doing better in terms of regulatory cooperation, and also in terms of strategic logistics corridors. So this is not only a border issue, but about how business is organized across space. It has to do with industrial clusters and how those are linked with physical infrastructure, road, railroads, air transportation, how regulation affects or impedes the flow of goods, how you connect services to the production of goods. I personally see this discussion on strategic logistics corridors as the spinal column of the whole bilateral and then subsequently trilateral engagement through the North American Leaders Summit process. But it's been challenging to move these ideas forward and to, so to speak, to put some meat into the bones. We've been advancing on issues such as trusted traders or trusted travelers. But when we think bigger, it's difficult. And here I think that academia has a lot to contribute. A lot of us knew Sidney Weintraub. Was a dear friend to many of us. He passed away a few months back, and he had the idea about NAFTA. He wrote a famous book called "The Marriage of Convenience," and people would say, "What are you talking about?" But it was a very analytical work. It was written with the head, not with just feelings. And then, of course, we've got again the late Bob Pastor. I was trying to think how to describe him, and I think you would call him the preacher of North America. He was a preacher. He was a true believer, and the last book he wrote was the North American Idea, and it's pretty persuasive in providing a vision and roadmap. And it's not incremental. It's thinking big. But I think we need people like Sid, like Bob, to really push the envelope. And I think that the Council for North American Studies here, and the center that Bob led, the Center for North American Studies at American University, can help us think about issues such as regulatory cooperation in terms of where are we facing the most transaction costs? Where should we focus? Not where we have quote unquote low-hanging fruit, right? Those of us in government love the quote-unquote low-hanging fruit. Easy things to achieve, and therefore we can show we achieved it. But low-hanging fruit might not be very relevant fruit. And I think academia can really contribute in terms of talking about regulatory cooperation, in terms of how SMEs can better participate in the regional production and supply chains in North America, in terms of energy. How connected are we in terms of energy? Because you might have the resource endowments, but you need to be able to help that energy flow across the region. How can you reduce negative externalities, adverse impacts on the environment? In terms of Mexico, we have the benefit of hindsight with different fracking regulations in different U.S. states, so we can sort of learn from our neighbor to the north and use our best practices. Here in this region, you have very close connection between research and universities. How can we do that better on a North American basis? So there really is a lot to do. I'm more bullish on North America than I've been for years. But I really think you need leadership. So at least from the political process, you have the HLED at the bilateral level. Now the Canadians will host the North American Leaders Summit. Perhaps Gilles will let us know what's in store. But I really do think academia has a huge role to play in showing us the opportunity costs we are incurring by keeping the status quo, where we can have large gains, what trade-offs need to be made, to be very analytical and daring and forward-looking. So if this sounds like an invitation or arm twisting, it definitely is. And I think I've used my 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. Since we started a little late, I think the conference organizers will spare us 15 minutes for questions and answers, or at least questions. So we have 2 microphones. Does anybody have a question? Yeah.
Thanks very much to all the panelists. I have 2 comments and 1 question.
Could you identify yourself first?
Yes, Gary Huff-Barrer with the Peterson Institute. The first comment is I was a little bit unhappy to hear both Fritz and Robert recycle this myth about the Mexican corn farmers, and I urge them to read the policy brief we did on NAFTA at 20. This is there's a myth of the NAFTA opponents that the corn farmers in Mexico were decimated. Very little basis to that. And I urge you to look at the facts on that particular story, because when it's recycled by people of your distinction, it unfortunately continues on. Second comment is to Michael Hart. I agree certainly with what he said about regulation and borders as being two big objectives, but there is a third one, and that's services. Services barriers are extremely high between our countries and internationally. It's well documented by the OECD, the World Bank, SAPI. They're well above agricultural barriers in many respects. Services, direct services trade is only 20% of world trade. Direct and indirect is 50%, but it's the direct trade which is highly restricted. Competition often does not exist in direct services, and that is part of or should be part of the agenda going forward. End of comments. Now for the question to Fritz. We know that both Senator Obama and Hillary Clinton ran against NAFTA in 2008 with some vigor. Of course, President Obama has rather forgotten that. At least let's say he's lukewarm. But my question is, if Hillary Clinton becomes President Clinton, from your inside, how much of this was just opportunism of the 2008 election, and how much is deeply felt by her because she's made hostile remarks over her career about Canada and international trade and so forth?
Do you have any insight on that, Fritz?
I don't know how much insight I really have in that. I was trying to be careful not to specifically reference the corn issue. I recognize it's complicated, but I stand by the general case that the transition has been more difficult for Mexico than the U.S. On Hillary, yes, she has. The answer is I don't know. I mean, she has a long history, as you alluded to, with NAFTA. One of the big issues of the first year of the Clinton administration was the strong effort that Bradley was directly involved in to persuade her to back off of opposition to NAFTA, which was tied up with their desire to move health reform forward. I think it's about, if I had to guess, it's about 60% political opportunism and 40% not opposition, but I wouldn't say it's ever been a high priority. So, it seems to me this is not something that has ever captured her imagination. I wouldn't expect it, so it's not just political opportunism in the sense that as soon as she's elected, you're going to go at this, with enthusiasm. That's my sense, but there are others probably in the room who have a better sense than I of her thinking on that.
Yeah, Michael?
Let me add a comment to that. Politicians who at this stage of the game want to play the anti-NAFTA card. I think it's even more political opportunism. It's a way to appeal to a particular constituency. But if you really think it through, let's say there's a new administration in 2016 who wants to undo the NAFTA. That is 22 years after the agreement was implemented. That's like trying to undo the GATT in 1970. Too much water's gone under the bridge. This is, an egg that cannot be put back together. It's been scrambled fully. If you were to denounce the NAFTA in 6 months, because the clause is a 6-month one, in 6 months, no one would notice. The only people who would really be upset about it would be lawyers, because the dispute settlement aspects of it, particularly between Mexico and the U.S. on anti-dumping countervail. Between Canada, there's so few cases now it doesn't matter. But those lawyers would be upset because there'd be one area where their fees would disappear. And that's about it.
Other questions?
Good morning. My name is Alan Young, and I'm with a private company in Chapel Hill called VIF International Education, and we work with schools to help make their programs more international. Dr. Ortiz Mena, I traveled across Mexico in 2006 from Tijuana to Cancun, and I didn't think much about violence except I was warned to not take taxis on the street in Mexico City. Now I go to Mexico and I look at the State Department map and I think, can I go here? Is it okay to here? I go to Puebla because I know it's safe. How do you see this question of violence and drug trafficking evolving in Mexico, and what is that? How will that impact long-term integration?
Yes, I'm glad that you've seen my country from Tijuana to Cancun. A lot of people just know the border areas, and it is a huge country with a lot of diversity. In terms of the security challenges, we evidently have security challenges in some areas right now. In the state of Guerrero, we have some challenges. We have some challenges in the state of Michoacán, but some areas that had high incidence of crime around the time you went, I think you mentioned 2006, if I recall correctly, are now much better off. For example, Tijuana is much better now than it was in 2006, and every 2 years that they, together with San Diego, they do a large science and business summit called Tijuana Innovadora, Innovating Tijuana, and which showcases the dynamism of the region. Another area that had some challenges was Ciudad Juárez, just opposite of El Paso, Texas. And again, the situation has improved markedly in that area. So what I can say is that the government at all levels is working very diligently in addressing these issues. They take time to solve, but they can be solved, as it has been shown in other regions. I mentioned in Tijuana, in Baja California, and Juárez, in Chihuahua. And now we're addressing some other challenges that we have in other regions, currently Guerrero and Michoacán, to name some other regions. But I would say that thinking long-term, Mexico really is undergoing a huge transformation over these past few years. The government has implemented a series of reforms that perhaps we should have done years and years ago. But anyway, here we are. Very far-reaching reforms on financial services to encourage banks to do something very daring, which is called lending money, instead of just buying treasury bills. And we have a very regulated banking sector, but there's very low financial penetration. We did a far-reaching energy reform, which was again both a public policy and almost psychological change, as big as NAFTA 20 years ago. We have a huge telecoms reform, and we have a very ambitious national infrastructure plan, because we don't do well in terms of the rankings for infrastructure in the WEF, World Economic Forum rankings, or in doing business rankings. So we can and must do better. But to tie this in with my previous comments, I think we really do have to think regionally. Not only, we act nationally, but we think regionally. I was looking some time ago at the website of an association called the U.S. High-Speed Rail Association. And they're an advocacy group to promote high-speed rail. And they say we need to invest more in North America. And if you look at the map they have their wish list of high-speed rails in the U.S., and then there's a great territory on the north and a great territory on the south. And I think of medieval maps that said Cabe hic dragones, like careful, here be dragons. Like, we don't know what's out there. I think there's something called Canada to the north, it's Mexico to the south. And I think even notionally they could have put those rails going north and going south. So that's what I'm trying to convey. Think big, think in terms of the future and think in very sort of pragmatic terms at the same time.
Yeah, Bob.
I would like to comment on this. I study tourism, and last night, just for my own amusement, I looked up a couple of figures. One, the State Department warning, the new one, is really, really scary, okay? If you look at the statistics on tourism, tourism in Mexico is hitting new records. It is coming from all over the world, including double-digit increases from the US and Canada. So it seems to be that people are still coming, spending money, traveling around, and this is a big industry in Mexico.
Aren't they just going there to buy drugs, though? No, just kidding. I think we have time. I think we have time for one more question.
Hello, I'm Carol Steimus. I'm the outgoing president of the Canadian Business Association of North Carolina. I had the audacity to ask a Canadian to speak on the repatriation of the furniture industry to North Carolina, which, as many we all know, this is a pillar in North Carolina of economics. Art Dufour, an Order of Canada winner, talked about why he relocated to Mexico. And one of the things he had to do was train a Mexican workforce in management because he couldn't get North Americans to go down there and run the factory. So I think there's been tremendous benefits to Mexico and side benefits as well to North America. But I just thought I'd bring that up as a benefit.
Well, I would ask you to join me in thanking our panelists for their very insightful perspectives.